First off, good morning, and thanks everyone for joining us today and helping us along our journey to update Ohio's Domestic Action Plan. If you need another acronym in your life, this is called the DAP. This is the very beginning of the process, and there will be many other opportunities throughout the year ahead to learn with us and engage with us on the DAP. I want to thank Dr. Sandra Kosek-Sills for organizing today's session, and she is Ohio's primary point person for the DAP. So please feel free to follow up with her with DAP questions. We do have a lot to cover today in our 3 hours together, and everyone has busy schedules. So if you are not able to stay logged on with us for the entire time, we are trying to record our session today, and we'll provide it on our YouTube channel in the future so that you can look up those sessions that you weren't able to join us for. And because we do have so much content to cover today, our presenters were asked to keep their presentations somewhat short and concise, but we know there's a lot of information, and we will put that additional information on the different topics on our DAP website for you to go back and reference. We're using the Teams format to keep this session informal. So people can type in comments and questions in the chat feature. I believe you can also unmute yourselves during presentations.
I'll have to do the unmuting. So what we're going to have people do is raise hands, but please wait for the Q&A sessions. Thank you.
Perfect. And then always remember to unmute or mute yourself again when you're done with your comments. So we have a range of speakers joining us today, and we certainly appreciate your willingness to share your information this morning with everyone. We will start off with our first speaker, who probably does not need an introduction. He is well known in the Great Lakes world, and that is Great Lakes National Program Office Director Chris Korleski, a native of Ohio. And he's responsible for implementing the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the U.S. and Canada. And that is where we get our authority to write DAPs. So Chris, thank you for joining us. I will turn it to you.
All right, thank you, Joy, and I will be very brief this morning. First, good morning, everyone, and welcome everyone to the call. I want to thank Joy, and I think Sandra, no doubt, did a tremendous amount of effort, along with many other people, to put this together. So I just want to say thank you, Sandra, and to the entire LEC for making this happen. So the DAP is critical. It is a critical component of addressing a difficult and challenging problem we continue to face, which is harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie tied to more nutrients than we need in the nearshore in particular. So I think the really good and exciting news is that we continue to partner together. And as I look at the list of attendees this morning, I see folks from all across the spectrum who have a stake and are extremely engaged in this issue, and that's great. I do want to point out that we in GLNPO, the Great Lakes National Program Office, we really enjoy and are trying to work very hard to coordinate with our colleagues in Ohio, who through H2 Ohio and other efforts and working with us on Focus Area 3, it's a very strong partnership, and we want that to continue. I think many of you know that the GLRI is putting a lot of money into coastal wetland restoration, habitat restoration, etc. So that's the kind of thing we want to keep doing. And I'll close with this. If you're not aware, you probably are, but we are now in the process of writing, it's hard to believe, Action Plan 4, which will cover fiscal years 25 through 29. Again, hard to believe we're starting to work on our fourth action plan. That the GLRI has been around and, at least in my view, has been successful enough to require or to mandate, let's keep going. So there will be a number of opportunities for outreach and engagement in the near future. Keep your eyes peeled for that. But again, we want to make sure we get this plan right. Nothing is static, nothing stays still. So we want to incorporate into this new plan everything we think it needs to be, and we need your help to do that. So I'm going to stop there. Again, thank you, Sandra and Joy, for the opportunity to speak. And Sandra, I'm going to just kick it over to you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Director Karleski. I appreciate your kind words, and hopefully we can continue to work together and be engaged in all of the facets of this process. All right. And I am going to share my screen. All righty. And I believe out of our team members at the state, we should be able to continue to let people in. Just in case I miss anyone while I'm speaking, feel free to hit that admit button in the people tab so that we continue to let folks in. All right. So my name is Sandra Kosek-Sills. I'm with the Ohio Lake Erie Commission, and today we're going to be talking about the Domestic Action Plan, Ohio's Domestic Action Plan, and the update we will be doing in 2023. So I'm going to start with a brief review of what the Ohio Domestic Action Plan is, and then we will touch on some of the implementation activities underway since the last time we updated the Ohio Domestic Action Plan. And I have some assistance from my state colleagues on that. And we will take a short break. And then after that, we will talk about the load reductions, status in the tributaries, and then close with what's next for the Domestic Action Plan. So what is the DAP? We've already mentioned a little bit about where it comes from. So the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, this commits the United States and Canada to address many issues affecting the waters of the Great Lakes, and that does include the excess nutrients. It was signed in its most recent, originally in '72, but most recently in 2012. And so the Great Lakes Water Quality Annex 4, which is on nutrients, called for the development of nutrient reduction targets where needed, with a focus on the western basin of Lake Erie. And so the targets were to be set by 2015, which we did, and the parties, the US and Canada, were to develop domestic action plans by 2018 to chart a course to meet those targets, which was done. And then these DAPs were to be updated on a 5-year cycle, which means 2023 is the year for the update. How does Ohio fit into this? The Ohio Domestic Action Plan is under the umbrella of the U.S. Federal Domestic Action Plan, along with Michigan, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. New York participates, but they don't have a domestic action plan because it doesn't have any priority tributaries in that state. So there's a section for each state within the current U.S. Domestic Action Plan that reflects efforts of each of these states. Based on the individual state domestic action plans. And each state has its own action plan, which is cross-referenced there, that helps us lay out better what our priorities are, what our jurisdictional responsibilities are, and our authorities to do this work. So that's kind of how the Ohio piece fits into the larger effort. So why are nutrients in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement? Human activity notably results in effects on downstream water bodies from increased nutrient losses, disturbance of the soil, adding fertilizer, etc. In Lake Erie, as I'm sure are all familiar, this produces excessive growth of algae. Historically, this was a nuisance algae problem, green algae just in very large quantities. That was very well handled by the actions under the original Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, but more recently we're seeing these harmful algae blooms, which are a cyanobacteria that produces toxins when they break down. So the agreement prioritized Lake Erie because these harmful algal blooms had picked up in severity starting in 2003. So in the 2000s, NOAA developed this HAB severity index to help track that using satellite imagery. So the image in the background is 2015. That was sort of our worst year in the sequence of harmful algal bloom severity. You can see that it bounces around quite a bit. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the tracking we're doing that feeds into this and how we're measuring other aspects of the algae and phosphorus that are causing this bloom. But here I just wanted to present, this is up through 2022. So for the most recent season, we're not as high as we have been at the maximums, but we are still exceeding what needs to be where we'd like to be in that gray zone, less than 3. So here we're looking at the Annex 4 goals as ecosystem objectives. So basically the 2 things we're trying to do here, it's not just all about the harmful algal blooms, although that is one of the targets. We want to reduce the amount of cyanobacteria biomass to mild levels at least 90% of the time. But we also have goals for the Central Basin. We have a maximum phosphorus load that would result in a dissolved oxygen concentration of at least 2 milligrams per liter in the bottom waters during the summer stratified period. So some of you may be following along with the Maumee Watershed TMDL process. That's very focused on the Western Basin, but Ohio's Domestic Action Plan is addressing all of the priority tributaries across Lake Erie under Annex 4, which includes the ones that go into the Central Basin. So, quick recap of where we are with the Domestic Action Plan 2020, the actions that we had in it. We were focused on these 4 primary sets of actions. We know from Ohio EPA's nutrient mass balance work that the majority of the nutrient loading is coming from agricultural land as a non-point source. So this is the main area of focus here, agricultural best management practices. We're also working towards enhancing the natural infrastructure in these watersheds with the addition of wetlands to filter out nutrients. We're also looking at actions to support communities, such as remediation of home sewage treatment systems. And to support this work, we are implementing watershed planning at multiple levels, from the HB7 broad regions that ODA is managing down to the HUC 12 level, which is the hydrologic unit code. That's about a 26 square mile, very small tributary. And this is helping us to place nutrient reduction projects on the landscape at a very local scale. There were other actions in the Domestic Action Plan previously, and we don't typically highlight these because they're not as direct, but I'm also going to bring this up here. So we have already looked at TMDLs, but most significantly, the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL is in its final stages now, I think, in draft format, and should be submitted this year. This will address phosphorus reductions in the Maumee River more holistically. In the past, there were TMDLs that were very small and scattered and not really sufficient to address what we needed to. We'd also like to update our list of partners who are actively working on nutrient reductions across Ohio, and this is a theme I will be returning to. We're especially interested in whether there are load reduction estimates being developed or tracked, and that would be for practices that are being funded privately, that are not being funded through federal or state sources, where we can track what's happening through the grant process. If there are actions that are being taken, for example, we've had Ducks Unlimited has provided us with information, the Nature Conservancy, we've had the Ohio Farm Bureau provide us with information, all of where they're getting funding sources that they either have themselves or through other pathways. And so we'd really like to continue to capture that information. The dredge material diversion rule has now been in place for several years, and significant amounts of dredged material are no longer being dumped in Lake Erie. So we're continuing to keep an eye on that. We have at the commission are continuing to look at beneficial use of dredged materials. We're also included in our DAP a number of support actions such as research and monitoring, and these activities are continuing, and we'll continue to update that. So For the update, what are we looking at? So each state is looking at updating our individual plans in addition to what the work that will be done at the federal level. Ontario and Canada have a joint plan. We'll probably continue to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit later on more specifically about all of the things that we're looking at. And again, I want to say we're at the very beginning of this process, and so there will be opportunities for folks to engage with us over the course of the summer. We're interested in speaking with folks one-on-one if you would like, or group to group if you would like, to kind of help us through this process. But here's some kind of broad categories, looking at what we need to do after the Maumee TMDL to update the DAP on that. Project and program updates from H2 Ohio efforts, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in a minute here. And then incorporating some of the new information we're getting from research, modeling, and additional monitoring. All right. Now, what I would like to do, see if we can manage to make this happen, I am going to turn it over to, I believe Terry is next, to speak more specifically about ODA's part of the puzzle.
Well, thank you, Sandra. Good morning, everyone. My name is Terry Mesher. I am the program director for the H2 Ohio program here at the Ohio Department of Agriculture. I'm going to share my screen, and if Sandra, if you could confirm that you can see my screen when it comes up.
Yes, that looks good.
All righty. Sure appreciate everybody taking the time to learn a little bit more about what we're doing in Ohio and with the H2 Ohio program at ODA. We started our H2 Ohio program. We started to deliver the program and implement the practices in 2021. And through ODA's program, we're focusing on the phosphorus reduction, but really nutrient reduction across the board. And we're really using three approaches for that. We're looking at improving nutrient management, reducing erosion or improving erosion management, and then better water management. Our H2 Ohio project area, you'll see a little map there up in the corner. Our original project area was the 14 counties in the northwesternmost corner of the state of Ohio, the ones that are have that green shade. Then in 2022, we expanded to an additional 10 counties. And the reason for that project area is that area, those 24 counties, encompass all of the land in Ohio draining through to the Western Lake Erie Basin as defined by Ohio Revised Code. We've had a pretty big startup, a pretty successful rollout thus far, and we have focused primarily to date on the nutrient management and erosion management portions. We are working on the water management. I'll talk about that a little bit later. For ODA's approach, when we started looking at the issue overall, our estimate is that 85% or so of the Western Lake Erie Basin, the Maumee River watershed, roughly 85% of that is involved in agriculture. And of that, the vast majority is row crop agriculture. So as we looked at trying to reduce nutrient loads, phosphorus loads, our first thought is the cheapest way to reduce phosphorus loads is to eliminate phosphorus applications that aren't needed for crop production. So we've been using the voluntary nutrient management plan as the cornerstone of our program. Any cropland that's enrolled in our H2 Ohio program has to develop and implement a voluntary nutrient management plan. That plan is going to require current soil tests and crop rotations and the nutrient prescriptions in accordance with NRCS's 590 nutrient management standard. We have nearly 1.5 million acres in approved current voluntary nutrient management plans since the onset of the program. Our enrollment right now is about 1.56 million acres across those 24 counties. And that enrollment is what we have coming into this crop year, the 2023 crop year. We're really proud to say that represents, that 1.56 million acres represents just a little over 35% of the cropland acres across those 24 counties. So really what I like to say is as you're driving through Northwest Ohio, as you're driving through those 24 counties, 3 to 4 out of every 10 fields that you look at are enrolled in the H2 Ohio program for 2023. We do have a lot of additional practices beyond the voluntary nutrient management plan. Those include a variable rate phosphorus application. Right now, we have nearly 820,000 acres enrolled for that for 2023. Overwintering cover crops, we've seen a lot of popularity with that, just a little over 600,000 acres in overwintering cover crops. We're really trying to push phosphorus placement. That's where the phosphorus fertilizers go directly from the fertilizer buggy directly into the ground. For 2023, we have nearly 350,000 acres enrolled in that. And then some of our small grains and our forages, really what that is looking to do is trying to continue that overwintering cover, about nearly 220,000 acres. And lastly, we are focused on better manure utilization. And right now, through our producers, we have about 175,000 acres enrolled in manure incorporation and utilization practices. Looking at our overall funding, we're going through a budget process right now in the state of Ohio. We're developing our biennium budget. Right now, our goal and our budget request is looking at spending about $60 million for each year in the Western Lake Erie Basin across that 24 county project area. And really our hopes are to grow that footprint beyond the 1.5 million acres and get a lot closer to the 2 million acres enrolled in the program. That would put us at about 50% of the cropland acres if we can achieve that 50 or that 2 million acre goal. It's a lofty goal. We're working hard to meet it. We are doing some things outside of the Western Lake Erie Basin. Really right now, we're trying to get the nutrient management planning effort started across the rest of Ohio. And we'll probably be spending about $10 million per year on that. And again, this is assuming that we have available funding through the budget process. We won't have our budget finalized until the 1st of July. We are making some program modifications. Originally, when we rolled the program out, we were focused on 7 cropland management practices, the nutrient management plan, some variable rate phosphorus application placement. What we're trying to do is we're really trying to streamline those practices to make the overall program easier to implement for our soil and water conservation districts and easier to understand from our producers. So we're transitioning from those 7 practices essentially down to 4. The nutrient management plan implementation, whether it be a basic or a precision plan, is up to the producer. Subsurface placement, manure incorporation, utilization, and then finally, probably the biggest change is taking all of the cover crops, the forages, and the small grains, and transitioning that into one overarching practice, which is essentially overwintering cover, so that we got living plants in the field throughout the winter. We have had continued excitement about the program. We will be taking re-enrollments for the program here later this year. Our existing contracts come to completion here in 2020 with the 2023 crop year. So our hopes are, once we get our new budget approved by the state of Ohio and we have our funding established, that we will be taking new enrollments across that original 14 county area later this summer through the fall and into the early winter of this year. As well, then in calendar year 2024 and into 2025, be expanding some of our signups in those additional 10 counties. We do have to work through a little bit of different contract periods and terms through some of that. And we're hoping by the close of 2025 that we have the entire 24 county project area on the same contract terms and the same specifications for the program. That's a real quick review of the program. I did mention that we are starting to do some of the water management, focus on that. Just recently, we've signed agreements to construct nearly 8.5 miles of 2-stage ditches across that 24 county project area. The ODA through the H2 Ohio program is paying for the construction, or the majority of the construction for those 2-stage ditches. We initially committed about $5 million to that effort. We've gotten just a little over $4 million in signed agreements for projects. We are looking to do a similar request for proposals here this year. We will be focused on the the Western Lake Erie Basin, but might open up some of those applications to the rest of the state of Ohio as well. And lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about some relatively new efforts that we have at ODA. House Bill 7 was authorized the creation of a statewide watershed planning program in 2021. We went through a process, and you're seeing the map of the 7 major regions, watershed regions across the state of Ohio as identified by the legislation. Later in late in 2021, we started to advertise for the positions, and we had all of our watershed managers on board with the Division of Soil and Water in early 2022. The first step that we've taken through this program is to complete a draft report of the characterization of the watershed and the water quality concerns across the region. The characterization is land uses, soil types, those sort of things, and really trying to just put the water quality concerns and land uses into kind of big bins, so to speak, that represent the region as a whole. The next step is we're starting the evaluation of best management practices that are best suited to address the regional concerns identified. Our hopes are, as we go down this road, that in the long term, that our plans and our regional watershed planning efforts will kind of guide what the practices that we're focused in on most for the H2 Ohio program. Also, what we'd like to do is provide support and supporting documentation, some of the basic information for some of our local groups that are doing more 12 level watershed planning. So I think that's all I've got, Sandra. That's my real brief overview. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm not sure if we're taking questions now or if we're taking them later, but
we'll do it later after everyone's finished in this block. So Eric, you are up next. I will say, feel free to put questions in the chat if you are so inclined, but we do have a few minutes for questions after we finish with this piece.
Very good. All right, everybody seeing the angry cardinal there? All right. Well, everybody, I'm Eric Sauce. I'm the H2 Ohio Program Manager for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and it's my pleasure to be with you today, looking through the attendee list. I know many of you, and I thank you for your interest in what we're doing with our H2 Ohio program and its role in the implementation of the DAP. So like Sandra alluded to, I think about our H2 Ohio approach as being puzzle pieces that fit together. You know, the different programs run through the various state agencies. None of us can tackle this nutrient loading issue alone. It really takes a coordinated effort. And like Terry, I'm proud of our efforts so far and what we've accomplished to date through our H2 Ohio initiative. So we all kind of bring our own unique background and expertise to bear when it comes to H2 Ohio. And our role at ODNR is implementing natural infrastructure. And we can think about that as wetland restoration, floodplain reconnection, enhancing our coastal wetlands, really bringing our ecosystem services to bear for our water quality problems that we face in Ohio. And this fits into a matrix of the best management practices that are being rolled out by ODA and the structural practices then that we're putting on the landscape. And we know when we look at natural infrastructure like wetland restoration, that it's cost effective, even when we look at just the nutrient reduction benefits that we can realize from this work. It's long term. We get these benefits year after year with our structural practices. And of course, there are additional benefits that we realize through something like restoring a wetland, whether you're a birder or you're into herpetology or you like to hunt ducks or kayak. There's a lot of reasons why bringing back a missing piece of our landscape can be of benefit and of importance to us. So we really view our H2 Ohio program at ODNR at the intersection of nutrient management practices and habitat restoration. So where we can do both of those things in one spot, that's a perfect ODNR H2 Ohio project. So a little bit about the structure of our program these days. Really, our principal effort is our wetland grant projects. So fully funding wetland restoration with nonprofit, NGO, municipal partners. We have grant awardees who range from our soil and water conservation districts to county park districts to NGOs like Ducks Unlimited or the Nature Conservancy. And as you can see by the logos on our slide here, within ODNR, this is an all hands on deck effort. Really engaging folks from most of the divisions at ODNR in this program and being the liaisons to those grant awardees. We also have a program called the Water Quality Incentives Program, which leverages our funding for projects with the Lake Erie Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, providing a cash incentive for private landowners to engage in specific practices within the CREP portfolio, wetland restoration, floodplain wetland restoration, and forest riparian buffer planting. That's something that we've gotten a lot of engagement in the Lake Erie CREP geography. We also have a robust H2 Ohio wetland monitoring program with the Lake Erie Aquatic Research Network. That's a consortium of different universities that are looking at our projects and analyzing them from a nutrient reduction performance standpoint and reporting back to us on that. And then in partnership with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we have the H2 Ohio Students Take Action program, where through Focus Area 5, that they've enabled us to put naturalists in the classroom across Ohio, across the Lake Erie watershed in Ohio, to engage students in anything from rearing seedlings to plant on our restoration projects, to monitoring the hydrology and reporting that back to us and to our research partners. So here's our dashboard of where we are to date. We launched in 2019. We have 141 projects that we have set into motion. And I just checked with my team today, and that divvies up really nicely. We have 41 completed projects and 100 projects in motion right now. $114 million invested into this. And that, that adds up to not just acres of watershed filtered and pounds of phosphorus removed, but also restored habitat for threatened and endangered species. 15,000 acres so far of wetland and associated habitat restoration in motion with our program. This is what our program implementation looks like on a statewide map. You can see just by the dots on the map that our primary emphasis has been and will continue to be Northwest Ohio, the Maumee River watershed and the Western Lake Erie Basin. But we have the ability to address water quality issues in Ohio where they lie, so to speak. We've rolled out our program in the Ohio River Basin. That's this portion of the state south of the little dashed line here. We've done 2 rounds of competitive grant funding in the Ohio River watershed. We're going to expand that to the Central Lake Erie Basin, as well as the Ohio River watershed in the next fiscal year. And we'll continue to treat Northwest Ohio a little bit differently because that is our primary area of emphasis. Allocating 60% of our funding to that geography and funding projects on an open rolling basis. Just wanted to mention, I alluded to it earlier, engaging private landowners in partnership with the Lake Erie CREP. We have over 150 landowners that have engaged in Lake Erie CREP with the incentives that we have put on top of that enrollment. Altogether, that puts our wetland restoration and similar types of projects. The grand total is somewhere north of 300 projects that we've initiated, either through our grant funding program or in collaboration with Lake Erie CRIP. If you'd like to track our progress from the comfort of your own home, we have about 30 of these chronologue setups at a subset of our sites. You can check in, and if you happen to be at one of these locations, you can add your picture to a time lapse of the restoration and how these projects are moving along. I mentioned earlier the Lake Erie and Aquatic Research Network's wetland monitoring program. They're in their second field season on some of our initially completed projects, and we are very proud of the monitoring program that they have built and that they are currently implementing, really advancing the state of the science when it comes to deploying natural infrastructure with a water quality purpose. And we look forward to their ongoing results coming back in and helping us sort of adaptively manage our program as we move forward. Moving forward, we have in front of the legislature right now a proposal for a modest increase of our funding for the next 2 years. We're looking at $35 million worth of natural infrastructure investment in each of the next state fiscal years, staying the course with about 60% of that funding in Northwest Ohio, 20% Central Lake Erie Basin, and 20% Ohio River Basin. And we've set a lot of projects in motion, but we know that we need to at least double our efforts to accomplish our goals. All right, and I'll wrap it there, and we can take some questions later. I've got my contact information there. Once again, thank you for being with us today.
Great, thanks, Eric. And we'll hear from Ohio EPA next. Josh, if you want to step up.
All right. Screen shared here. And on. All right. Thanks. Sandra said, my name's Josh Griffin. I'm with the Division of Surface Water. I'm Ohio EPA's Lake Erie project manager. And so I'm going to quickly go through Ohio EPA's activities under the DAP. And first, I'm going to focus on what our communities are doing to address nutrients. Then I'm going to talk about some of the watershed planning efforts Ohio EPA has been working on. So addressing community sources is a multi-pronged approach. As Sandra mentioned earlier, we do recognize the non-point source component as being the largest piece of the loading to Lake Erie that we're working to address. But that doesn't mean that we're not still doing work on the community sources side. We have ongoing investment in wastewater infrastructure, a lot of emphasis on managing our combined sewer overflows, household sewage treatment systems, or HSTS, and also kind of working with those household sewage treatment systems is extending sewers to unserved communities. One of the primary ways that Ohio EPA helps facilitate the investment in the wastewater infrastructure is the implementation of our state revolving fund. We call for the wastewater side the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund, WPCLF. We administer this fund to help communities make large investments in their wastewater infrastructure. This table here on the slide shows the loan values for infrastructure projects in the Lake Erie watershed. But these loans, they're not a complete picture of the total amount invested in infrastructure by our Lake Erie communities. But they have used this fund to invest over $400 million in infrastructure since 2019. All WPCLF loans offer a below market rate for for the loans the communities would receive. A portion of those loans, though, we're able to offer as principal forgiveness that's related to the annual capitalization of the loan. And from 2019 to 2022, this was about 5% of the total loan value in the Lake Erie watershed. Another program that Ohio EPA has developed through WPCLF is in response to HABs. We offer rate discounts for nutrient reduction projects. These projects can receive a 0% interest rate. That program represents a substantial amount of the projects in the Lake Erie watershed. And two examples of what those projects might be is the communities of Cary and Genoa upgraded their facilities to meet new nutrient limits. So those will represent substantial reductions in phosphorus loading in the Lake Erie watershed. So again, these loans are only a portion of the total investment in infrastructure, and communities use many other programs and private financing to fund projects as well. Briefly mentioned one of the major influences on infrastructure upgrades is to improve management with combined sewer overflows. Many of our Lake Erie communities operate with combined sewer systems where the stormwater and sewage are conveyed through the same pipes. When precipitation events happen, these combined sewer discharges discharge stormwater and untreated sewage directly into streams. To address these discharges, long-term control plans have been developed with Ohio EPA and US EPA oversight, and all of our communities are making progress on these plans. A substantial amount of the investment we talked about on the previous slide is dedicated to reducing these combined sewer overflows. And I wanted to highlight a few communities that have reached some major milestones. And in that, we've had 7 communities who've completed all of their construction projects identified in their long-term control plans. And of note, within that group, that includes Toledo, which is our largest community to date to reach that milestone, and our largest combined sewer community in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Also, Akron, Lakewood, and Euclid have completed major projects to increase the total treatment capacity at their facilities. So this reduces the amount of sewage that may have to bypass during the facility during a wet weather event. NERSD and Lima, Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and Lima in the Western Basin have completed very large storage projects where they can store the increased flows during precipitation events to be treated once the treatment flows recede. So these projects provide benefits. Were not initially targeted for nutrient management, but they are addressing substantial human health concerns, and we're realizing secondary benefits for improved nutrient management by reducing these untreated wastewater discharges. Another area of focus is that household sewage treatment systems. And Ohio EPA has facilitated improvements in household sewage treatment systems, both with H2 Ohio and also with the WPCLF fund as well. So with H2 Ohio, we've been able to provide funding from $115,000 to $250,000 to local health districts in the shaded counties identified in the map on the left. And those funds are used to repair, replace, or connect homes to sanitary sewers where better treatment can happen. And the water WPCLF has been used for a long time to help fund those same types of investments. And most of our counties in the Lake Erie watershed have received awards since 2009, and those can be anywhere from $150,000 a year to $300,000 a year. And the other side of improving these household sewage treatment systems is When communities get substantially dense, the ability to treat the sewage on site and disperse it through a traditional leach field diminishes. And these unsewered communities often have discharges that are poorly treated to local streams. So we can facilitate the extension of sewers to these homes. One substantial project that was completed in the last several years was sewering of Kunkel in Williams County. And this community had been under enforcement by Ohio EPA to be served with sewers. And we were able to make that happen the last few years, thanks in part to some investment from the H2 Ohio program. And one unique thing about that project is there are other nearby communities that may be able to also be served by that treatment facility in the future. So that kind of wraps up Ohio's EPA's work with community sources. I'm going to go through some of the watershed planning efforts that we've been working on the last several years, including our 9-element non-point source implementation strategies and the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL. So our 9-element plans, we often call them 9-element plans, kind of in short. They're strategic plans to work at the small watershed scale, so 15 to 62 square miles or so, is about the size of a Huck 12, and the plans help tie the projects to the best science, ensure that they're addressing the worst problems, and ensure that they're working towards long-term benefits. They're developed to identify those projects specifically, but the plans can evolve with time, specifically as we find new projects that we would like that are identified that are consistent with the existing goals and objectives of the plan. If new data becomes available, or if there are any changes to the goals and objectives of a plan. One example of something that might change the goals and objectives of the plan was plans were traditionally developed in the past to address near field water quality concerns. Ohio EPA identified localized impairments in streams and water courses. But as the issues in Lake Erie re-emerged, I should say, we recognized that these plans could also serve a value in addressing the far field impacts. And the 2020 DAP included these far field targets for total phosphorus in the Maumee watershed. So we've started to utilize those far field targets to develop our 9-element plans. And the map here on the screen shows how we've started to develop or revise many 9-element plans in the Maumee River watershed. But I would also note that these plans are developed throughout the Lake Erie watershed. And it's important that we are able to work with local organizations to develop these plans as they have that local knowledge and relationships to identify projects that can meet our water quality goals. We have an interactive map with all of our non-point source 9-element plans available on our webpage, and I have included the link here. We can drop that link in the chat when we're done here. The other major planning effort Ohio EPA has been involved in is the development of the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL. I'm not going to go into a lot of details. We have a lot of documents and outreach materials posted on our webpage that I've shared the link to here. And we have some common goals between the TMDL and the DAP, especially this TMDL is focused on the harmful algal blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie. Our reduction goals are aligned, and the actions we're looking to utilize to meet those goals are also aligned, and we'll work to ensure that they're aligned here in the revisions. The TMDL is not final yet. We had posted the draft. We have comments. We're working on evaluating and responding and updating the report in response to. But we will be submitting that final TMDL report to US EPA by June 30th for their review and approval. And that wraps up what I have for the presentation at this time.
Okay. Thanks, Josh. All right, and I have, so we have about a 5-minute window for questions, and then there's a 5-minute break after that. So I am going to put in the chat. If you don't have a question now, but you think of something later, or if your question doesn't get addressed today for some reason, please feel free to contact me after I have put that in the chat for you. And this is the first time we've tried to have a meeting like this. So I believe I'll have to unmute you, but I believe folks can raise your hand. I think Esmita, if you are listening, could you try that? I just want to test that out because I know I have unmuted you. So you can let me know if it doesn't work for you. All right, I do have a couple. Okay, let me see. All right. Okay, so Rick Graham, let me see. I can allow you. That should come up for you. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask a question. Rick, are you there? You should be able to unmute.
Gotta actually unmute myself. Okay.
Yes.
A couple of questions relative to the details. I'm not familiar with this Microsoft meetings platform as much as Zoom, but anyhow, the reality is we have concerns as to actually what was attained under the Annex 4 during the initial period that we had supposedly a 40% phosphorus reduction, and is it being considered to go to a split compensation platform whereby practices are one part of the compensation and performance of the desired goals is another aspect of the strategy as far as the compensation. So anyhow, there are just a lot of things get involved really quick in dealing with the practices, timing and sequencing and other things that aren't necessarily locked down in the actual practice. Variables ends up with a lack of performance on what we're actually paying for and need.
Terry, is that something that you can address, please?
Yeah, I could try. Certainly with managing an effort this large, trying to manage each individual field gets to be a challenge. But that said, I want to review a little bit of what our overall effort is and how the program works. Is we go through an enrollment where a producer basically tells us year by year what practices, what field they want to do those practices on for each of 3 years that's written up within the contract. At that point, once we go through the contracting phase, then ODA and the local soil and water district set the money aside for those practices so that we have those in our coffers to pay the practices once they're completed. Then, as we go through the crop year, the producer, the program participant, has to certify that practice and provide documentation of when those different activities were completed. And then the local soil and water conservation district verifies those. So that said, when we talk about placement, for example, we receive documentation and we receive the actual photographs. We take in what date the placement was completed, and that documentation then, along with the nutrient management plan, is reviewed to make sure that, number one, the nutrients were recommended. The two, that the recommended rates were less than, or the applied rates were less than what was recommended. And three, that the actual practice happened within the time frame that is required within the practice standard. That verification is happening at the Soil and Water District before the actual practices paid. So within that, we're asking producers to provide the documentation, cover crops, for example, seeding dates, seed tags, and the like, to go ahead and make sure that we're meeting all of those practice guidelines. So from that standpoint, we do have a fairly good looking over the shoulder or a process to make sure that the practice specifications are being met. I'm very confident that we're doing a really good job of that. To your larger question, when we start talking about paying for performance, I think that's the part that we're, at least from my standpoint with ODA, we're really still trying to learn exactly what the impact and what the overall effectiveness is of these practices are on a year by year basis, and that gets to be very difficult when we're talking about a project area the size of the Western Lake Erie Basin or the Maumee watershed. Literally, we're talking about millions of acres. We're talking about hundreds of different kinds of soils. We're talking about variables in rainfall and weather patterns every year. So those are the sort of things that we're trying to noodle out as we move ahead to better assess the program. I hope that answers your question, Rick.
Right. Well, we're going to jump back into it. Next thing we're going to talk about is load reductions. And there's two parts to this. The first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the H2 Ohio programmatic reductions. And then I am going to, we'll have Esmita talk to us a little bit about the model efforts. So first of all, I just wanted to mention this part here. So we've got the Annex 4 targets are usually expressed as metric tons, and I think most folks are used to seeing it that way. Within Ohio, for the purposes of the H2 Ohio program, we've calculated the load reduction as pounds. So our target for the Maumee River is a reduction of 1 million pounds of phosphorus annually. And that would bring us down to a 1.5 million pounds, down from the 2.5 million that would be the 2008 baseline phosphorus load. So that's just as a brief explanation as I show this slide. So each year, the H2 Ohio program produces an annual report by the end of August to the legislature for what we're doing with all this money that we've been spending on the program. And part of that is to do a programmatic estimate of the load reductions. And so in that case, we're looking at practice by practice, what we anticipate the reductions being for the work that we're doing. So here that the complete ring is the total of the 2.5 million baseline phosphorus load. The dark portion of that ring is the goal that we're trying to achieve, and the light portion of that ring is the reduction that's required. So we kind of pull that out, and in looking at that, each of the agencies has done some calculations based on the number of practices they put in and our best estimates as to how that translates into load reduction. And so you can see on here, we are partway to making this goal. We're anticipating that we're down more than 230,000 pounds in the aggregate. We still got quite a ways to go. We have another 766,600 pounds to go on our load reduction. The point of this is the calculation like this, it's based on presentation. And so it's kind of a rough estimate. And we're looking at ways to further refine this estimate for the next biennium to provide better baseline information about loads on agricultural fields if there was no practice there. And ODA is also working on improving their technical capacity to more precisely define program implementation. So that's something that'll be underway in this coming year. And improvements in this estimate will be part of what we'll be working on in the next year. But there are other ways to estimate the effect of best practices for the watershed as a whole. So I'm going to turn it over to Asmita Murumkar at Ohio State University. I have to give me a moment here to switch slides over. Asmita is going to talk to us about the SWOT model work that we have been doing and we have funded through H2 Ohio. We're hoping this will give us more information or information in a different way about the performance of H2 Ohio across the watershed. And pardon me for just a moment while I get this switched around. Yep. Okay. That's part one. Part two is, let me get this shared. Okay, I think I've got you here. Asmita, can you see it?
Yes. Can you hear
All
me?
right. I can hear you, so just let
Oh.
me know when you want me to switch the slides.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Good morning, everyone. I'm Asmita Murumkar, research scientist at Ohio State University, and I'm going to talk about the water quality benefits of H2O practices using high-resolution watershed model. So this is a collaborative project among Ohio State University, University of Toledo, then University of Wisconsin-Madison, and USD ARS, funded by HABRI and OLEC program. Next slide. So today I'm going to talk about how we are improving. We already published like a first phase of model in 2021, but we are improving it using the remote sensing data and as well as the conservation practices improvement using edge of field sites. Then I'm going to talk about the H2 Ohio practices, water quality benefits, how we are modeling these practices, and how we are going to summarize the results. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, yeah. So this is a project view. We are using remote sensing mapping of conservation practices such as buffer strip, crop rotation to give as an input in our model from 2008 to 2021. In watershed model, that's like a soil and water assessment tool for Maumee River Basin, and we are going to use this model for seeing the different practices effectiveness at field level as well as watershed level. Next slide. So soil and water assessment tool can predict the water quantity, water quality, sediment, soil carbon, and some of the greenhouse gas emissions. So SWOT model takes some input data as stream and topography, soil, land use, and land management, along with the climate data. So one of the main point of here, like a high resolution, our hydrologic response unit, which is the smallest unit in SWOT model, is delineated at field scale so that we can see the effectiveness of any practices at field level as well as watershed level. That's our like developing the high resolution model. So we can use this model to see the some state scenarios effectiveness for the conservation practices, or like really targeting and prioritizing these practices at certain locations, see the effect of these practices from implementing at some specific locations. Next slide. So how we are really improving our input data or model, high resolution watershed model. We are using remote sensing data to see the corn, soybean, winter wheat rotation along with the tillage practices. We are using our soil test phosphorus S2P values distribution at county level to apply the heterogeneous representation of soil P values. And based on that, we can apply the manure based on the location of permitted and unpermitted facilities, so that based on STP values and crop need, we can apply manure. And wherever the manure does not meet the plant needs, we are applying the inorganic fertilizer. Along with this input data improvement, we are seeing the placement of the subsurface phosphorus application, cover crops, as well as the tile drainage spacing using the Ohio Drainage Guide and wetland locations. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So using the previous one. Sandra, can you go to first slide, that previous one that, yeah, thank you. So using remote sensing data, we are seeing the type of tillage practices over a period of like almost more than 10 years. In the past, the distribution of cover crops in the watershed, location of buffer strips and crop rotation, just said about the corn, soybean, wheat rotation in our model. So this is like a high resolution information we are giving in the model. Previously, we are randomly placing these practices in the watershed, but now using the remote sensing, we can see the actual locations in the watershed. Next slide. So once we have the input data implemented, everything, we are calibrating our model at 3 different locations, Waterville, Tiffin, and Blanchard. And we are going to validate for the same location as a back validation from like 2005 to 2009. If you see the pink triangles where we are going to validate at the varied sites, we're not going to calibrate because we don't have the continuous water quality and flow data from these sites, but we are going to just see the validation at these locations. Once we have already calibrated and validated a high resolution model, we call it a second phase. We are going to validate this model using the age of fill practices information, such as water quality and flow, like surface drainage as well as tile drainage discharge from these age of fill locations, USDARS, as well as public-private partnership where we focus on legacy P phosphorus. We're gonna set up a benchmark using this age of fill network to see the nutrient losses from the different practices. Next slide. So we are going to use this develop a high resolution model to assess the current and future water quality benefits of H2O practices. Next slide. So we have laid the 3 different scenarios based on H2O practices to like representation in our model. I'm going to assess the impact of these practices. The first one, we're going to see the practices sensitivity analysis, such as like we are going to implement one practice at a time and see the which practice is more beneficial for the water quality benefits. In second phase, we are going to bundle all these practices into one and see the impact of this H2O program till date, 2021, 2022. And based on that, we are going to run the model to see the future implementation to reach the 40% reduction target using some funding availability from H2O program. So I'm going to talk about detail how we are going to analyze and assess these practices in the model. Next slide. So this model scenarios is like, this is the development process. We are going to evaluate the 9 out of 10 H2O practices except 2 test ditch construction, as we don't have routine in our model. We have the semi-annual meetings and continued feedback from H2O program managers from OLEC, ODA, ODNR, and OHIP, as well as we have a bigger stakeholder advisory group, which is representation of 17 plus members of state agencies, non-profit organization, profit organizations, and industry. So we got a feedback on this model scenarios to run through the model. Next slide. So first objectives is like really see the practice sensitivity analysis to evaluate the impact of individual practice at a time through model and see the how much benefit we can get from the one practice. So just I told, except the 2-stage ditch, we cannot represent right now in our model. And we are gonna increase the percent like basically percent area under each practice based on the domestic action plan. I'm going to run the model for the climate years 2008 to 2021, as we have a remote sensing data for these years. And then we're going to see the nutrient and discharge output produced from the for the Maumee outlet, as well as individual feeds where we implemented these practices. Next slide. So based on the domestic action plan, this is like a one example I'm giving you, are cover crops, and one more, there is animation. Sandra, can you click one more time? So this new application acreage used to determine the like percentage of model agriculture areas being added to the model. And we already have some percentage to the first baseline model, and we are increasing this acreage under each practices based on domestic action plan as a new application acreage in our model, and see the impact of this additional acreage under each practices for the water quality benefits. Next slide. So this is the laying of practice sensitivities of each practices. Currently, there are two different ways we are seeing baseline scenario. That is like a first version of our model published in 2021, where we have some percentage of adoption in our model. And then we are gonna run this another scenario based on the domestic action plan, gonna increase how much percentage will be under subsurface nutrient applications, such as like in baseline, we have 10% of cropland as received a subsurface nutrient application. Whereas in scenario, we are gonna increase that 23% of cropland and run the model and see the effectiveness of this placement in our model at field level as well as watershed level. Next slide. Again, the remaining one, we are gonna see the impact of conservation crop rotation, then cover crops, drainage water management. Currently in baseline, we did not have like 0% cropland under drainage water management, but in scenario run, we are gonna increase that 10% and see the effect of drainage water management. We also developed the wetland routines in our model to see the impact of wetlands at watershed level, as well as where we implemented the wetland to see the impact of effectiveness of implementation of wetland at that location too. Next slide. Once we have found out like which practices is more beneficial for the water quality benefits to reaching the 40% reduction target, we are gonna bundle all these scenarios together to go in the model and run it to see the impact of bundle scenarios. And we're gonna run like for example from 2008 to 2021, same. See the impact of the current program implementation from years 1 to 3. Next slide. Yeah, I think next one. So in the last model scenarios, we're gonna see the future management guidance based on our first two. I'm gonna based on the continued enrollment of cropland at a rate of 5% per year, and based on the funding availability from the H2 Ohio, for example, 5-year funding versus 10-year funding, and then until reduction targets are met. So assumptions is practice continuing to indefinitely after enrollment, then future impact assessment using the past climate years, as we can see the future climate as well, but we are going to run for this for the past climate and see if we get the funding for 5 to 10 and until reduction target, we are reaching that goal or not. And then nutrient and discharge output from the Maumee outlet, as well as the affected fields where we implemented there's practices. So we got a data from ODA of the enrollment at HUC level, and that's the one thing like we try to implement these practices, though there are some limitations based on the spatial scale of data availability to put in our model. Next slide. So currently, this is the acreage enrolled by 2022, and we're going to increase this 5% incremental as additional of approximately 72,000 acres per year to see the impact of future implementation of H2 Ohio program at watershed level. So continue enrollment for 5-year funding, continue enrollment for additional 5 acres of acreage for each year for 10 years. And then we are like estimated 20 years of funding to see the reaching the nutrient reduction target. So we're going to run the model for these 2 different scenarios and see the impact of these practices enrollment at field level as well as watershed level. Next slide. So right now we are running our model for these scenarios. So how we might summarize our results. So this is the conceptual graph. This is not based on the model outputs. So we laid these 3 scenarios as practice sensitivity, seeing the practice at implementation of practice at a one time at watershed level, as well as bundle scenarios as bundling all these 9 practices in our model and see the impact of current H2I implementation program. And then based on the funding availability, like 5-year, 10-year, and until reduction targets are met, to see the spring DRP reduction target as well as spring total phosphorus reduction target. Next. These are some publications from our previous modeling efforts, and based on this publication, currently we are improving our model. If you need like more detailed information about like how we are applying manure application, so you can refer CAST et al. 2021 paper, how we are how the internal watershed process, like multiple sort models. We can use the Apostol et al. 2021. That's our first page model to see the different internal hydrologic processes in our model. Yeah, and I'm happy to take any questions. Next slide.
Okay, I think we have a question in the chat from Sandy Ben. Are acres using commercial phosphorus versus liquid manure versus solid manure being evaluated? How is this looking at farms that use 0 phosphorus for soil management being factored into these models? Sandy has a lot of questions. I don't know if you want to take these one at a time. How are increases in phosphorus coming into the system factored into this? And how are continuous monitors being tied to this assessment?
Okay, so first, I can talk about commercial fertilizer versus manure application. So based on the K4 location, permitted and unpermitted from 2017, if I'm remember correctly, the recent data for the region, we are applying manure to like nearest 5 miles, 10 miles location based on the crop need, and wherever the crop need is not fulfilled by the manure application, we are adding inorganic fertilizer. And this is again based on the STP values at that particular field. And again, this is like a distributed based on the county level soil test phosphorus availability. So I'm not sure about the liquid manures and solid manure, how that evolve later, but I will definitely get back to you. I will ask Jeffrey how he did that in a model. So second is how is the looking at farms that use 0 phosphorus for soil management being factored into this model. Yeah, I'm not sure about this one.
I can, as me,
yeah, Josh.
I've been following the modeling effort for quite a while, so I can maybe speak to that a little bit. I think, and that's been a bit of a limitation of the SWAP models, is looking at situations where farmers might not be using it if their soils aren't aren't demanding a phosphorus application to continue to grow the crop. So I think the SWAT models have traditionally always had a crop removal application applied on most all HRUs, unless we were testing a situation where we were just reducing the total phosphorus applied. But I do think that one of the model improvements is incorporating the county level soil test data. So I do think that's going to help the ability to test those kinds of scenarios where we know that phosphorus management and the use of phosphorus is not the same across all acres in a county. So I do think that is something that's being improved within the models right now.
Yeah, and again, with that, like if there is a STP value is greater than 50 ppm, we are not applying fertilizer at that locations, and we are running the model to see the zero application of fertilizers like phosphorus at that particular field. Thanks, Josh.
I think the next question was, how are increases in phosphorus coming into the system factored into this?
Can you repeat that? I think maybe I missed one.
It says, and how are increases in phosphorus coming into the system factored into this?
That's a good question. I think we are not increasing phosphorus. Like basically, we are not factoring the increasing phosphorus coming into the system, as we are just every year our rate of application is the same based on the STP values and location of this cathodes. Yeah, I think that's the thing right now. And as per the crop need, basically, if there is a crop rotation in corn versus soybean and everything, so based on the type of crop, we are based on the recommended tri-state, we are applying fertilizer to the field.
She's also asking, how are continuous monitors being tied to this assessment? I think that would be related to the way that you are validating the model.
Yeah. We are validating the model at different locations, and we put the point source data like about the wastewater treatment plant as an input in our model.
Okay, and this last question, I'm not sure is a question for the modelers. She says, lastly, the goal is nutrient reduction, but there's a different standard for wastewater plants, phosphorus reduction to the system versus fertilizer and manure with no input reduction targets, and why? And I see Josh has popped in. I don't know if you want to try to address that. That's not really a question for the modelers.
I can try to address that a little bit. I mean, managing phosphorus from wastewater plants and on the agri landscapes, there's quite a bit of differences there. One, our wastewater treatment facilities, they're discharging directly to streams. So anything that comes in through their influent, they treat it, and what they don't remove from the wastewater stream gets discharged directly to the streams. Whereas a land application of manure or commercial fertilizer, we're putting, a lot. We're putting enough fertilizer on the land surface to fertilize a growing crop. There's also fertilizer, or there's also phosphorus already in that soil system that is there. All of that to maintain fertility for that crop. And then we lose a portion of that phosphorus, whether it was already in the soil prior to fertilization or if it is from a more recent fertilization. So we're losing a small percentage of that annual phosphorus application in that instance. So the input side and managing and reducing the amount applied and more appropriate, or maybe better stated, matching that to what the crop demands in a better way is certainly a focal point of nutrient management planning on the non-point source side. So managing those inputs and improving those management of those inputs is an important component. But it's a kind of a different thought process and philosophy from wastewater treatment plants that are treating and then directly discharging to a stream.
All right, thanks, Josh. Lisa Durianchik asks, is that an average for the county for soil test levels that you're using?
So not an average at the county level kind of thing, but like we have max and mean values and from the Libiditans data at county level, and we are randomly distributing these values under different acres in our model. Yeah, so like low STP values to high STP values based on the county estimates of this data.
Okay. Next question is, how will the model factor in that the baseline for the 40% reduction is more likely greater than the loading in 2008 due to the increase of loading in the basin due to new animal facilities? And how will you address legacy areas?
So like in terms of the legacy areas, we are having this distribution of STP values, and we are looking the discharge and nutrient coming out of this legacy fields. And so another question like, okay.
I can jump in
I
again,
think, yeah.
I think, as Mita, and I think I can help you out here. So we are, the SWAT models have, like any modeling effort or any way you look at things, you have to make simplifying assumptions. So, the models don't necessarily vary once they establish the cropping pattern and fertilization pattern for a year or for a crop rotation. It's not varying that with time typically, but we do use new information to revise those strategies, and we do look at different situations when scenarios are run. So for example, we're not using the 2008 livestock information to evaluate manure inputs into the watershed. Currently, it's the 2017 estimates because of that being the most recent census year. When the census of 2022 is available, probably around 2024. I think those results will come out. That will be an opportunity for us to look at what really did change since then. But we're not evaluating livestock inputs based on what was there in 2008. It's more of a recent evaluation.
I can add to that. Our first baseline model used the 2012 CAFO location information. And so now with new model, we have the recent one, and we can really compare the result between these two models to see the increasing CAFO locations in the recent years. Thanks, Josh.
Okay, one more question from Lisa. Are the practices simulated in this particular model analysis limited to H2 Ohio funded and implemented practices only? If so, how will your report discuss results, given this is only a portion of the actual conservation footprint in the basin?
I think maybe Sandra, you can help me in that if I'm saying wrong something here. But like, for example, laying this scenario, we tied to H2 Ohio program, but like if you see in the baseline model, the first version, we have some percentage under each practices. So I think maybe
I'll just add that we are in parallel with this project and not being covered in detail here. We also funded some work to look at remote sensing of the practices existing in the watershed. So anything that was a visible change in the landscape, cover crops, buffers, strips, that sort of thing. We've got a couple of those. If it was something that remote sensing could see, we've developed a model. The University of Toledo folks have developed a model that will look at some of that. As Josh says, we do have to make some simplifying assumptions here, and I think there will be instances of practices that wouldn't necessarily be found in that remote sensing survey that might have some effects, but we are in fact focused very much on changes due to these H2 Ohio practices. So, in some ways we're holding some of this other stuff constant if we can't necessarily see it. So, all right. Okay, that brings us to the time for the next presentation. Thank you so much, Esmita. And again, if there are follow-up questions, please feel free to contact me and we'll try to put you in touch with the right folks. So next up, I am going to share again. And we will be talking now about monitoring data. So I believe we've got Josh on deck for the first part of this. And just let me know when you want me to change slides.
All right. So just to highlight some of the monitoring efforts that are going on within Lake Erie itself, and also in the watershed, is what I'm going to kind of go through really quickly here. So when we're looking at the algal blooms in Lake Erie, from a recreation perspective, our monitoring largely relies on the NOAA GLERL satellite observation data. That's the data that feeds into the harmful algal bloom forecasts and their reports throughout the season about how big the bloom is, where it's at, and where it's going. I think you jumped ahead on me. I wasn't ready quite yet. Wrong direction. There we go. But we do have some additional sampling relative to evaluating the algal blooms, and that is that's within Sandusky Bay, because the bloom we see in Sandusky Bay is quite a bit different than the bloom we see throughout the larger Western Basin or what's out in the open waters. If the bloom comes out into the Central Basin, usually it's typically I believe a Planktothrix dominated bloom. The relationship between toxins and algal biomass is quite a bit different. We've seen some really interesting things there over the years, so we're relying on grab samples, collaborating with ODNR and Bowling Green State University to get actual toxin samples to help with that evaluation in Sandusky Bay. Go ahead to the next slide. The drinking water side of that is very much more focused on actual toxin concentrations and less so algal biomass. So our drinking water utilities, our communities, are sampling their intake water, both the raw intake water and their treated water, especially if they have microcystin in their intake water. That we're making sure that water delivered to their customers is safe. We're using that raw intake water to evaluate the condition of Lake Erie relative to the drinking water systems. Go ahead to the next slide. And leaving the algal bloom space on Lake Erie, there's also a lot of monitoring going on to evaluate and improve our understanding of Central Basin hypoxia. Some of the long-standing monitoring, one of the longest-standing monitoring efforts is through the Cooperative Institute of Great Lakes Research, Siegler. They've had fixed stations out in the lake for quite some time now. over a decade anyways. And that's really helped start improving the model and helping us understand how and where hypoxia happens. Ohio EPA, since about 2010, has been helping with some of that data collection, and we collect transects going from our nearshore areas where we don't have hypoxia, transecting out to the area where the Lake Guardian gets in the deeper water, and kind of capturing some of those edge effects of hypoxia, and that's been helpful in understanding how hypoxia works and improving the models as well. And in the last several years, a substantial effort's been undertaken to leverage USGS's Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observing System, GLaDOS. It was developed largely to track fish movements in the lake, but because they have that platform out there, there's been a great collaboration between USGS and NOAA to put dissolved oxygen sensors at those sites. And that's really increasing our spatial density of continuous dissolved oxygen monitoring in that lowest level of Lake Erie. Go ahead and jump to the next slide.
I'm going to break in for just a second, and I just want to explain to folks, we don't have results data to show you on hypoxia right now. This is an area of active work on the Annex 4 team, because we know we have this general ecosystem objective and we have a metric that ties it to phosphorus, but we don't have a good way of actually measuring that 2 milligrams per liter DO level. So it's thought that this setting up this monitoring program and doing some further work on what the output needs to look like will help us track better. So we don't have results on that, but this is where it's going as far as monitoring. Okay, thanks, Josh.
Yeah. Thanks, Sandra, for clarifying that point, and definitely some real progress on those models and how understanding hypoxia. So, the other place we monitor extensively in the watershed is in the tributaries. We've invested heavily in stream gauge monitoring, continuous monitoring of nutrients. A lot of emphasis in the Maumee watershed going up into it and understanding the sub tributary loads, trying to make sure we're capturing different parts of the landscape at the small watershed scale, knowing we can't monitor everywhere all the time, but those monitors extend throughout the Central Basin as well, with some smaller and upstream gauges in the Sandusky River as a larger watershed. But really across the Central Basin, we have a good record of water quality monitoring in the tributaries as well. We've traditionally summarized that in the Ohio Lake Erie Commission has published summaries of that data on their page. That's what the link here on the slide is to. So if you want to see some of the summaries that they've done of that data, you can go to that link. And from here, it's going to jump. We're going to go to Laura Johnson, and she's going to talk a little bit about how we use that data to understand things in the watershed.
Awesome. All right. Okay, so this is sort of jumping right into some of the longer term trends that we're seeing from the Maumee River. You can see this is showing total phosphorus, both in terms of loads on the top and then concentrations on the bottom. And then on the other side is the DRP, also known as SRP. We use that term interchangeably. And what the data are showing are the actual loads, but then also a flow normalized load, which would be essentially using a method that smooths the data based off of, basically tries to remove some of that year-to-year variability that we can see associated with flow. And when we do that, you can see that this is from 1982 through to 2021, I believe, total phosphorus trends. you know, they had a bump down in the 90s associated with the implementation of erosion control measures, but they really haven't changed a whole lot since around the mid 90s through to today. So the past 20 years, we see a lot of variability in total phosphorus loads, but they haven't changed a lot. SRP, you can very clearly see that big increase in loads that happened from the late 90s up to the early 2000s. And we're hopeful that with loads, we're starting to see the beginnings of maybe a reduction. Maybe we're starting to itch down, especially if you look towards 2010 to 2020. But we also know that we've had 3 years of fairly low loads recently, and sometimes that can affect the ends of these types of smoothing methods. For the concentration trends, you see essentially the same sort of thing, slight decrease in total phosphorus and that same sort of decrease and increase in SRP. I do want to point out here that when we're doing something that's flow normalized, it does tend to lead to a lower, for those of you who think about water quality a lot, a slightly lower concentration than what we see when we do our flow weighted concentrations. So you can't necessarily compare these flow normalized concentration levels to what our targets are because they're not exactly the same thing. Okay, next slide. Another way to look at this, and this is something that you've seen me present probably every year for the past 4 or 5 years, is to look at our load and compare it to stream flow discharge. And that's what I'm showing here. It's for total particulate phosphorus. Remember the particles that get trapped on the filter. Dissolve reactive, also SRP from the previous slide, so the stuff you can't see that gets filtered out or makes it through the filter. And then total bioavailable phosphorus, which is what we use for our forecasting. And this is showing that load versus stream flow discharge. These data are from 2002 to 2018. You can see the line showing the data. You can see the gray line of the targets. And then we have 2 error bars basically encompassing the variation of the fit of our loads, to that line. So it kind of gives us a little bit of confidence intervals. And what I think should stand out here is that there's a really good relationship between load and flow. When we have more flow, we have more loading, and that we haven't seen a lot of deviations from this line from 2002 to 2018. The gray spot, and Sandra, you can hit next, it should pop in with years. Perfect. Is 2008, which is what we are our baseline year. So you can see that that is on the higher end of flows. We have had higher flows since 2008, but that's up there. And so that's where our baseline is. And you can move to the next slide. And then these are years since 2018. So 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. I want to point out, so 2019 is our oddball year for dissolved phosphorus and total bioavailable phosphorus. Those loads were outside of those expected ranges. So we saw lower than expected loads based off of how much flow we had. We didn't see that for total particulate phosphorus. In 2019, it was the second highest loading of total particulate phosphorus that we'd ever had for this March through July period. 2021 and 2022 have nothing to write home about. They're about where we would expect. But 2020 had higher than expected total particulate phosphorus loads. And so you can see that in this figure, on that one figure there where it's above that error bar line. Based off of this data, this is not smooth. This is just our empirical data that we're not seeing strong trends deviating outside of these, going down in the way that we want to see. However, to get outside of those error bars, we probably have to see a pretty substantial reduction to actually detect that change. So just keep that in mind. 2019 for DRP and total bioavailable phosphorus was on the order of 25% lower than expected. And you can see we're just outside of that range of variability. Okay, next slide. So what I want to do now is sort of re-envision the data that Josh just mentioned for the water monitoring summary and see what are we actually seeing across the watersheds. And the way I did this, Sandra, you can start clicking through, some arrows are going to start popping up. We are combining USGS data from those upper watersheds. Then we move down the Maumee and bring all those together. And then we move to our watersheds, which are in green. And you can see we have the monitoring going from the Maumee all the way over to the Cuyahoga. So I tried really hard to make it go from upstream down to downstream in terms of how these are configured together. All right, you can go next. And so what do we see? So this is dissolved phosphorus concentrations. So it's from 2014 to 2021, because that's the most cohesive data set we have. Although I'll note the St. Joseph, St. Mary's, and Huron have fewer years than that. And so I marked those three stations on our axis there. And what I'm showing is our median phosphorus flow weighted mean concentration, and then there's a maximum and a minimum. Because this time frame is fairly short and we didn't see very strong trends across these different sites, I thought it would be easier on our eyes to see all this together. What you note is that there is some variability, right? The St. Joseph is lower than the St. Mary's, right? And they kind of come together on the Maumee up. As we move down through the watershed, we see a general decrease in flow weighted means on average for this period of time, which is typical. As rivers get bigger, we usually see what we call a scale effect, where you start to see a slight decrease in concentrations because we're seeing lots of different inputs come together, and the river doesn't go up and down as rapidly as a small ditch would. You also note that the Portage, Maumee Downs, Sandusky, all very similar to each other, right? They're almost exactly the same. And then we start to see a drop off when we get to the Huron and the Cuyahoga. And the Cuyahoga has notably lower concentrations compared to all the other sites. Next slide then, Sandra. And then this is for total phosphorus, same sort of setup here. But probably what you're noting is that there's a lot more variability. Now remember, this is a maximum and a minimum here. So when we look at something like the St. Mary's or the Maumee River in Antwerp, which is Maumee up, those really high points are basically just 1 year of data that was especially high. And a lot of those, especially when we get to the Blanchard and the Auglaize, is 2020, where we had especially high total particulate phosphorus when we looked at the figures before. So we did have some years that were off, right? Because there's just 1 year where we got really high concentrations compared to other years. But in general, these patterns are really similar to what we saw with dissolved reactive phosphorus, right? St. Joe's a little lower, St. Mary's is higher, and a general decrease as we move through the watersheds. In this case, you can see the Cuyahoga doesn't drop off nearly as much. Huron and Cuyahoga don't have as drop off nearly as much as they did for dissolved phosphorus, because they both have the types of soils that tend to be a little bit more erosional, and they provide good amount of total phosphorus. What's important to remember for something like the Cuyahoga is that it's below the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and that total phosphorus is not very bioavailable. You saw that because DRP was very low. So we're seeing some variability across these watersheds. I think you can draw yourself a line if you wanted to for the Maumee relative to its target, and see we still have some movement to go in terms of getting down towards that target. And a quick reminder, which will make Josh very happy, is that we can make momentum, we can make improvements across all of these watersheds, and that's what's going to help the end of our watersheds, right? Everything is contributing to what we see at the pour points here. So any efforts we make anywhere are useful. I believe that's everything for me, Sandra.
Yep, that's the last slide I have for you. So now we have some more time for questions. So we could take any questions that we have. If you want to go ahead and raise your hand, or you could drop in the chat, which will be easier. So I see this is more of a comment than a question from Peter Hess. So are there any questions for Josh or Laura on the monitoring program or the monitoring results so far? I got a couple hands up, so hang on a second. Okay, Chris Winslow, I believe you can unmute yourself. There you go.
I have. Can you hear me then?
Yes.
Great work, everybody, today. This has been phenomenal. Just a quick question. So I think it's in the current draft of the domestic action plan. I've recently bumped into that figure that has spring DRP load on the vertical axis and discharge on the horizontal, but they break it up into two time periods, that 1983 to 1999, and then the 2000 to 2021. Have you done this analysis here with the total phosphorus and the one before in those bracketed years? Because clearly you're showing the regression line for 2000 to 22 relative to the 83 to 99 are different slopes and clearly lower. It'd be nice to see these dots analyzed in that fashion. And maybe it exists already and I haven't seen it. I'm sorry, folks.
I will just clarify where that graph is, where you saw it. It's in the TMDL in our source assessment work that we did for the Maumee TMDL. So we developed that one at Ohio EPA kind of after seeing how Laura started presenting this data to kind of highlight, I think, kind of two different phenomenon that we saw in that 1990s timeframe when we saw some better conditions in Lake Erie relative to the algal bloom and the more recent years. And those two things were, yes, that slope was different, and also we have had some extremely wet years in the last 20 years. I believe all of our biggest blooms were associated with those very wet years.
Yeah, so Chris, I would love to be able to do this for all of these watersheds, but unfortunately, we only have that type of analysis available for the Maumee at Waterville, the Sandusky, and the Cuyahoga. So we wouldn't be able to do that because we just don't have the period of record for the rest of these watersheds. Most of these ones from the, that are in the water monitoring summary started in either 2014 or 2017. Our Blanchard River and Tiffin River sites, I think we started in 2008, if I remember correctly. And then the Portage started in 2011. So, it's really strange to be able to have the data set of that period of time to be able to even do that type of analysis, honestly. So.
All right, Rick, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I'm open mic now. My concerns relative to a lot of the issues relates to the runoff and the overall details as to the period of concentration and timelines relative to the runoff. The soil stability, erosion, sedimentation aspect combined, I think, is maybe looking at our rivers, the Sandusky River, the Huron River, which I have frequent access to, along with the many others that I'd happen to catch sight of at different times when driving around. The erosion, sedimentation, loading, and what it carries with it are of a great concern. And I think, how is your data addressing the complicity of those issues?
So Rick, you mean how does our data sort of reflect those types of issues here at Heidelberg?
Yeah.
Or at USGS?
Yes.
Yeah, well, so I think it's important to remember that, most of these runoff events are happening during really high flow events, right? So when we collect our water samples, we are monitoring during those high flow events. So we're capturing all of that variability. At Heidelberg, we monitor pretty much every storm event unless we have equipment breakdown, which reflects directly what's happening in the watershed. We can look at things like our long-term efforts in this region to implement erosion control measures. And using that information, we have been able to publish multiple papers showing that our sediment levels and particulate phosphorus levels decreased in response to the implementation of those control measures. So we do see watershed scale responses. Unfortunately, obviously, we're not seeing that with our dissolved phosphorus or total phosphorus in a shorter time frame, because those types of things take time for us to be able to detect. And that's the role then that we have to rely on edge of field monitoring by Kevin King's group at ARS, or even the Purdue ARS group, or even USGS. They're all these different people doing work, trying to monitor what's coming out of the edge of field. And if folks aren't aware, between us and USGS, we're doing our watershed scale models. We collaborate very closely with those edge of field groups because we want to be able to pair these different things together. The final thing to note is that we're starting to, with the help of Jay Martin, get into looking at a pilot watershed study where we're trying to implement as much of everything in one watershed to be able to answer some of these really hard to answer questions, such as, well, once we actually have everything on the ground, how long does it take to see the differences? What is it going to take to see the changes in dissolved phosphorus versus total phosphorus, and those types of things? Margaret Kalsick's group and Asmita's group that were doing all of the modeling are part of this as well. And we have a huge group that we're hoping that we can you know, it'll take a few years, right? Because we haven't even started implementation yet on that. But we hope to get to the point where we can answer some more of these really hard questions. So hopefully that answered all your questions there, Rick.
All right, Laura, we've got a question in the chat. Oh, I see Rick's raised his hand again. Hang on a second. While you look at that, I will. All right, Rick, I've allowed your microphone.
Okay, another aspect, are you in any way monitoring nitrates at all? Health impact on nitrates is so significant, and I know the organization I'm involved with is now expanding Nitrate Watch significantly across the country. So anyhow, just is looking at that particular one.
Yes, we do. Both us and USGS, we monitor nitrate as well as other forms of nitrogen. I have been doing that for a whole period of record as well. And in fact, there's some really cool new nitrate sensors that are out. So we are trying to get those in a lot of our different watersheds so we can actually get better, even better resolution on nitrate information. So I totally agree with you. Nitrate gets really high, especially in June, and it oftentimes exceeds drinking water limits. There's evidence that Sandusky Bay might be nitrate limited sometimes too. So understanding the nitrogen you know, dynamics is going to be important. We are working on a paper on nitrogen and nitrate dynamics that should be out as soon as we can get it submitted. So probably in about, you know, submitted in a couple months, hopefully. And then Peter asked about the differences and the causes of the differences in the north and south of the Maumee River in terms of phosphorus concentrations, either for total phosphorus or SRP. And in general, what we're finding when we look at the differences in these watersheds is there's multiple factors that can cause these differences. Oftentimes there's a soil type issue. So when you look at sort of the like northwesternmost parts of the Maumee River, when you get especially like Tiffin River up or the St. Joe, it shifts soil types and it shifts in slope. And so you don't see the same type of issues that you get in other parts of the watershed. Also, because of that, the St. Joe and the Tiffin tend to have lower amounts of very intensive agriculture. They have a little bit more pasture, and that seems to be playing a big role, at least from our assessment across our watersheds, and that loss of particulate phosphorus, as well as the potential for leaching of dissolved phosphorus, especially through subsurface tile drainage. When we get to those really heavy clay soils, the poorly drained, lots of tile drains where you see a lot more dissolved phosphorus loss. But then when you flip it and you can see on this figure here, we get to the Huron, then we're getting back into a heavier, you know, higher slopes, and we start to get a little bit more of those particulates. But in those places, we don't see the same type of pasture cover. So but that's why we think we see a little bit more losses there.
All right.
That's all I see.
Okay.
Great questions, everyone.
Yep, I don't see any other questions right now, so we're going to move on. There will be time for questions and a little bit of more open discussion at the end. So let me get myself organized here. All right, so that was a little bit of a heavy data section, and now I'm going to kind of bring us back around to more of the policy and domestic action plan implications piece. So again, we'll have what I'm going to talk about in this section, a little bit about the timeline. There'll be opportunities to comment and meet and share your actions. And then go through some of these updates to that we're going to be looking at that I mentioned earlier. So the timeline, and please do watch the space on the Ohio Domestic Action Plan page. If you go to lakeerie.ohio.gov and click on planning, there will be a tab under there for the Ohio Domestic Action Plan. I'm trying to post updates, and we will also be using our events tab for meetings. So we are open to this, what we're calling ad hoc coordination. Just drop me a line, let me know If you would like to have a meeting similar to what we did in earlier rounds to talk specifically about projects and programs that your organization is working with. We are also working with the state agency staff on the editing and revisions simultaneously to work on some of the material that we've talked about here where there are going to be updates. I will also highlight that we will be looking to do a public meeting sometime in mid-September to mid-October. I don't have this scheduled yet, and the hope would be to have that as an in-person meeting. At that point, we should have a draft Ohio Domestic Action Plan to show you and to receive more comments and input on that. We're hoping to have that then go through some final review process and have at least the draft of the Ohio Domestic Action Plan in advance of the Annex 4 webinar, which is usually held around about November, so that we'll be able to provide that to the wider group of folks that join up on that. And we're aiming to have our final Ohio Domestic Action Plan ready by the end of 2023. And we are starting the process of working more directly with US EPA and what they will need to pull into their plan as well. So that's just a quick overview of the timeline. I did want to, again, highlight partner actions. I may be reaching out to some folks that have worked with us on this in the past. We have Farm Bureau, the OACI, the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District has also provided us with some of the information. A lot of their work on stormwater in the Cleveland area is also germane to these conversations, because some of that work will also have the effect of reducing nutrients, and that goes into the central basin of Lake Erie. So that's important work for looking at the hypoxia target. So if you are another organization and you are doing work that is not federally or state funded, but is funded by some sort of your own organization's funding or other funding sources, please reach out, let me know. We're especially interested in seeing if we can start putting some more load reduction numbers onto some of this work now that we've come a few more years down the road. Then I want to say a few things about adaptive management. So we talk a little bit about adaptive management in the Ohio Domestic Action Plan 2020. We have, worked through the Annex 4 process to come up with the assessments and developing our strategy. And we have accomplished a few of these pieces in the previous Domestic Action Plan. The MAMI TMDL took that a little bit farther in looking at how the TMDL process works and where the milestones would be for the outcomes there. We have a strategy in place that we're still working on implementing, and we have we have monitoring in place, but we also have Annex 4 is working on some of the analyses for the loading trends. That's where we get that the original slides that Laura was showing with the flow normalized information. So we are working definitely through Annex 4 to get some of the larger load estimates that are not just Ohio, but also other portions of the watershed. And there's also an adaptive management framework that is in the final stages up there. So that will give all of the states a little bit more guidance about how to think about adaptive management in this context and how to line up our cycles so that we have Annex 4 doing some of the heavy lifting with the evaluating progress, adjusting strategy. So right now we are still in the early stages of getting some of these later stages of the adaptive management worked in, but we're definitely keeping it front and center. And we do feel that we have a good strategy so far, and we need to give it some time to truly be able to test it. We're hopeful that some of these trends that we're seeing are at least going in the right direction, but we also know from previous work that we have a ways to go to get implementation across the watershed that will be sufficient to kind of do what we need to do. So we're still sort of in a implement the strategy phase and monitor the response. And so we're going to look at this a little bit more as we draft the new Ohio Domestic Action Plan. And of course, I mentioned this before, a big piece of what we're going to be looking at, including the TMDL from the Maumee watershed, is much farther along. As part of that process, Ohio EPA would like to update the far field targets that Josh mentioned with the map that he had in his presentation earlier on, in order to align those with the strategy in the TMDL. We need to make some small adjustments that will be reflected in the all the way down to that very small HUC 12 watershed level, so that we have the correct targets for those smaller scale watershed plans. Okay, so a little bit more broadly. So H2 Ohio, obviously, we had a big section on our presentation up there. A lot of water has gone under the bridge, both literally and figuratively, since we did the DAP in 2020. H2 Ohio was still very incipient at that point. Now that ODA in particular has a lot more experience with how the program is playing out, we have a lot of adjustments to make in talking about it. Just for example, we've started to implement a requirement for that voluntary nutrient management plan up front before the farmers are eligible for the further along practices. So quite a bit of updating to go there. And then we had a listing of projects for ODNR wetlands in Appendix F, and the DNR has really been cranking along with this wetland projects. And so, I mean, as soon as we post a list, it'll be out of date again, because I know they've got a lot of activity going on, but it definitely needs update. And I know we do have some constructed projects now, or at least one out in Sandusky Bay area. So that'll be really interesting to see a coastal wetland kind of as an implemented project. So we'll have to look at how we're going to integrate some of that information. And then Ohio EPA, there's been some adjustments with the home sewage treatment system. Some of this is going to be information that we may pull from the TMDL as it is more updated and those kinds of projects. But we're also really interested in looking at an update to the technology assessment program. That was just there was not a whole lot there when we did the DAP in 2020, but we now have had 10 technologies that went through an assessment process, and we are working on looking at ways to do pilots of those practices, move them on, or demos, move them on to the next phase. That includes a range of manure processing technology that can help to turn this manure into a more transportable product, so that we have that as in the mix as something that farmers can use instead of commercial fertilizer, and utilize it at the correct levels in their fields and be able to distribute it and turn it into a benefit. And other pieces in that are phosphorus reduction or phosphorus-free treatment for non-contact cooling water, other industrial uses, some wastewater uses. So there's been quite a bit of action on that program since the last time, and we'll need to do that as well. And then again, we didn't mention this in the earlier part of the discussion, but we do have an H2 Ohio dashboard now, and this is providing information on a county by county basis, looking at what practices are going in which counties and how much. So that is now available as a tracking tool for that aspect. So H2 Ohio has done a lot of work over the last couple of years, so we're hopeful we'll be continuing to do that. So we will be updating a lot of the information in the DAP that's related to H2 Ohio. And then, so Asmita had this slide in her presentation, and I just want to bring up here, we're hoping to receive the results of this sometime over the summer. So that puts it in the mix as far as we may want to comment on the results, what that may mean for policy, whether some of these practices turn out to be considerably more useful than we thought or less useful than we thought, or this will be our first estimate at what kind of a time frame we might be talking about to achieve the targets, given obviously a lot of assumptions, but it'll start scoping out some of the information that we can maybe use to tweak our strategy if that becomes necessary. So we do want to incorporate that. And then some of these other pieces that we have in the domestic action plan, we've been doing a lot of research over the years. ODAG has its harmful algal bloom research initiative. I think Laura mentioned some funding going through there. We've had quite a bit of work done on innovations in agriculture actions. So I mentioned the technology assessment program and some of these technologies for manure processing. Various funding sources have looked at addressing high soil test phosphorus fields with phosphorus filters. There may be some leverage there to look at some of those fields that have a higher output, that we could deal with them a little bit more effectively in a more intense way. We also have a HABRI project going for improving understanding of two-stage ditch function. If you recall, as Asmita was speaking, this is the one practice that there's not really a good way to model, because SWAT is focused on what's happening on the fields, what's happening with the crops. It's less informative about processes that may be happening along the streams or in the streams. And so we're hoping that some of this information might become something where we could adjust the model, maybe make it even more useful, or at least give us more information about the effects of the two-stage ditches. And then we have been working through our Ohio Lake Erie Protection Fund in a very small way, looking at beneficial use of dredge materials for agriculture. Some of that is Dr. Angelica Vasquez Ortega at Bowling Green has been doing some of that work for us, and that's showing some really promising results. Just more generally, we're looking at evaluating the impact of rivers on phosphorus delivery. We're starting to get a little better handle on what's happening with edge of field, and Kevin King's got his research program looking at that. We've got a lot of information about what happens at the Waterville gauge, but we also want to think about what does that mean in the river systems, and is that part of what is maybe causing a lag in the system? So that's an important project. We have a GLRI project that'll just be starting up for the commission this coming year, where we're going to pass through some funding to improve the forecasting of bloom toxicity. Because sometimes we have a very large bloom with low toxicity or a small bloom with high toxicity, we need to look a little bit more at that, and that may be relative to the nitrogen issue, whether or not we may need to start thinking about nitrogen as it relates to toxicity. HABRI is also funding a fair amount of work to improve understanding of toxin exposure pathways and improve our understanding of health effects of harmful algal blooms. We've got some doctors at University of Toledo looking at those effects. And Laura mentioned briefly the paired watershed studies. So that is more work that's ongoing. Some of these things, we have information that may be coming through that will be useful in the DAP, and others of them is going to be continued work. And Eric mentioned the LEARN program. So to whatever point, this again is the wetlands are new. We've just been putting them in. This LEARN program has done their baseline year. It's very, very, again, at the beginning of things, but at some point we'll start to get some more information from here that ODNR will be using to possibly adjust some parts of their strategy. All right. This is what I have for you today. So we will look now. I wanted to, in the spirit of attempting to be more interactive and more like an actual workshop, I did pad some time here at the end. So hopefully we can do a little bit more of interactive questions and comments. And I do see there's been some things in the chat, so I'm going to get caught up with that. Asmita, did you want to add something?
No, I just mentioned about Jeffrey's paper where he looked at different scenarios related to fertilizer application, for example, no manure. So I just put some couple of articles links in the chat.
Okay. Let me see. All right. I see a question here. How will Ohio ensure the load reductions from Michigan and Indiana will occur? You know, we are all participating, Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, in the Annex 4 process. We all have seats at the table in the Annex 4 subcommittee, but the states also coordinate directly. We've had several states meetings where what we have done is had the states be the primary drivers of the meeting, talk about what each of our own individual priorities are, what our shared concerns are around, whether that's point source numbers, or how are we addressing our individual types of agriculture in each of our domestic action plans. So we continue to coordinate very closely, and I'm not sure that putting any more structure on it than what we already have would make any changes. We do also have the collaborative, which the governors of the the governors of Michigan and Ohio, along with the Premier of Ontario, have recommitted to working together as jurisdictions at the state level to move forward with these reductions and to commit to each other that we were going to participate in this. So we do have some state-to-state agreements, as well as the federal to federal agreements that we're all operating under. And I think that, you know, we're making a lot of progress, and we do a lot of communicating. So I think that each state has its own jurisdictional authorities. And so, you know, working together is about the best we can do. And yes, Laura adds that the monitoring locations are well placed to separate out the loads. Yes, that was done deliberately as part of that conversation. And I see, Rick, you've got your hand up, so give me just a second here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Relative to the level of the Annex 4 for the previous section, what level did we actually what did we get to on our reduction? What was the actual level that was determined to be what we gained as far as reduction in phosphorus for the first 10 years?
That is a really difficult question to answer because it goes up so much from year to year. At one point, you know, Michigan had been looking at their numbers and saying, hey, these are down. But then you have a really wet year and a lot more loading comes through. And, you know, if it's outside of that 90th percentile, it makes it look like you're back to where you started. But the process, the targets themselves are a 9 out of 10 year target. So it's very difficult to kind of pin it down. The other thing to keep in mind is that 2008, as Laura showed, was a fairly wet year. It was picked to be that 90th percentile wet year, but most years are a lot less than that. You know, the average is going to be around the 50th percentile. So in any given year, we're generally pretty close to having achieved a 20% reduction. We haven't really reduced it because we can see in the concentrations, in the flow weighted mean concentrations, that they're not coming down, but the load might actually be at that 20%. So it's not an easy or straightforward of a question to answer as you might expect. So we're
Yeah,
watching both of those things. And actually, we're watching the response in the lake too.
Having looked at a lot of the watersheds and read a lot of the data and looked at the open lake conditions in that, I'm a little suspicious. And initially, wasn't it supposed to be a 40% reduction, not a 20%? The 20% may be where we're getting close to. I don't think we're there. But again, adaptive management on the initial 10 years was supposed to deal with it accordingly. Yet, as far as I saw or understand, there was actually no adaptive management decisions made to crank down on anything. So anyhow, I'm concerned with adaptive management strategy and with another domestic action plan that we must incorporate more crankdown as far as adaptive management if we're going to achieve the goals that we really need to get to.
Well, we think that one of the things that we think is that we have not had enough time to do enough changes to really truly evaluate the strategy that we're in right now. We have ODA has done a tremendous job to get to 30% of the acres under voluntary nutrient management plans, but we know from the previous multi-model work, which was not as specific as what we're looking for in H2 Ohio, but we know that they weren't seeing reductions that would get us to those targets until the watersheds were achieving 60 or 70% application of the practices. So, it takes some time. The farmers need a couple of years to adjust their practices. They need to learn how to do these practices. They need to build confidence that they can do them and that they will see edge of field load reductions from that. So, we do feel that this is a process that's going to take some time. And Josh, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think we also try to look at some of the other indicators of progress, knowing that it's going to take time to move the total BMP count up to a level where you can detect change at the watershed scale. But because of that annual variability, if we had a 10 or 20% reduction in the last decade, it would still take more time for us to say with confidence that we've achieved that. Because of the annual variability and flow, it takes time to say there's definitely a trend, and we're confident that we've achieved this level of reduction when you're looking at that watershed scale. So, as we develop the TMDL and collaborating with the DAP, we've started to look at some of those lower level indicators we can use to help us talk about progress. And it's not all about. Ultimately, it's all about what's happening in Lake Erie, and we're monitoring in the watersheds, but also we can look at some indicators across the landscape, like soil test phosphorus trends in the watershed, which we have which the data would suggest are starting to head downward. So, improving nutrient management across the landscape is first going to cause soil test phosphorus to decline. That happens slowly. So even as you improve nutrient management, you start to make these programmatic gains, it's going to take time for that part of the system to respond. We can look at the remote sensing data, and we see things, we see some upticks in the BMPs that we're promoting and working to facilitate implementation with through all of our programs, both at the state and federal level. So when we look at those lower level indicators, we do see directional change starting to happen, though it will take more time for us to reflect that as you scale up through the system. And there's also a good project trying to hone in on that at the watershed scale that hasn't been mentioned today, but is underway in Potato and Shallow Run in the Blanchard River watershed, where we're pairing those two watersheds together and really working hard to get that level of implementation up of some BMPs to that 70+% threshold, and trying to kind of force that situation on a smaller part of the landscape so we can kind of hypothesis test the strategy more acutely and more quickly. So, there's a lot going on to try to document progress.
All right, other folks who have comments or questions, you can circle back and ask a question if you feel like you haven't gotten an answer, or if you've thought of something else that you'd like to mention, or if you, especially I would like to hear from you if you or your organization wants to be part of the partner actions effort. I'd love to hear from anyone who would like to share something about what they've been up to. And, feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat.
Can I put in one more comment?
Sure, go ahead, Rick.
Okay, I'm excited about this TMDL program and its initiation in that. I have a feeling it may reveal some interesting information and actually identify where our problems are. My suspicions are that there are most of the problematic watershed areas are going to be are flagrant in their activities in some of the stuff that's going on with what I have observed and seen through the two organizations that I'm heavily involved with. So, I know where the problem is going to make it, the focus of our efforts a lot easier. I know that I'm hoping for better cooperation. I know when it was initiated, the Distressed Watershed program back a few years ago, how it ran into problems because there was a lack of commitment on the part of some individuals, organizations, entities, whatever you want to call it. But again, I'm excited about the TMDL efforts, and I look forward to seeing that information come out, and we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else? I was looking to see if any of our Michigan or Indiana partners were on. I think they were on a little while ago. I don't see anyone right now. All right, well, we can wrap a little bit early if we don't have questions or comments further at this time. I am, again, available either at my email, which I had put in the chat earlier, or let me put it in there again. Hang on. Happy to have conversations with folks as we start to work on these processes, and looking towards, I'm hoping to get, now that I'm gotten past this workshop, we will look towards getting that later opportunity on the schedule and be able to get some information out to you all. For those of you who signed up for this meeting and said you wanted to be on the mailing list, if you were not already, I did add you to my contact list. So you will be getting future emails from us as to when these other opportunities will be happening. And I think that I'm encouraged by the number of people who signed up, and we will also send the information once we did record the meeting, and I'm going to have to check on whether or not we can make the slides available and how we might do that. It may be possible to have them as PDFs on the Domestic Action Plan page, but I have to check on that. We were hoped to make this recording available similar to what we did for the one we did in 2021 as a series of shorter videos, maybe edited a little bit so that we can get that on our YouTube channel. So thank you all very much for your time and attention. Looking forward to continuing this conversation. Appreciate it.